You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Clem, Matthieu, Tom, Saul, and I will talk you through our top 5 films of 2019. The structure is really simple. We'll go in a circle where each of us present our 5th choice. Then once we're all done, we'll move on to our 4th choice, 3rd choice, 2nd choice, and finally our number 1 personal favorite film of 2019. In the cases where a film is on multiple lists, we'll skip it for this spot and allow the person who loved it the most to present it. This is also because as our love for the films grow, each film will be given more and more time. I have to note though, overlaps are a shockingly minor exception here. There are actually only 3 films that are on 2 lists. None are on more. There were 25 open slots in total, and this means that we will cover 22 whole films. So that's just incredible. This could so easily have become a 10-film episode. So, before we get started, let's do the mandatory moment of introduction where you hear each of my co-hosts' voices and can attach a little bit of personality to each of them. And to make it slightly more interesting, why don't we throw in a very quick assessment of the year that was before we start. For simplicity, let's do it in alphabetical order, starting with Clem.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Clem. I'm from France. 2019 is not a year I'm very familiar with at this point, obviously because it was only last year, and I feel like films usually get exposed after a few years because it gives us more time to explore said years and go through the biggest film of the year, and also give us time to explore. I feel like we haven't discovered everything that this year have to give, but I think the selection of films we have is a pretty good one to start with.
Hi, I'm Matthieu, also from France, and 2019 was, I suppose, maybe not the best year if I'm looking at my list overall, but I suppose I don't really believe in years being that much better than others.
Hi, it's Tom from England. I'm excited to share my top 5 films of 2019 with you today. I thought that 2019 was quite a solid year in terms of the quality of films that I've seen. In total, 70 films from the year, and 9 of them received an 8 out of 10 or more from me, which is enough for me to consider them favoured. So it was quite tricky to whittle them down to just 5, but I'll share those 5 with you very shortly.
Hi, it's Saul from Australia. This was an interesting topic because when it came up, I wasn't sure if I wanted to discuss it or not. I think it's a bit too soon to go into 2019. I've seen a similar number of features to Tom. I've seen 64 films, but if we go back every year from 2009 to 2018, I've seen 100 or more films. So I don't feel like I'm even halfway through 2019. And already we're being asked to come up with a best of list. So what I'll be discussing today is my 2 favorite films of the year, as well as 3 films that I think maybe they're not necessarily in my top 5, but films that I think have been massively overlooked. Because if I was just going to do my top 5, I'd be getting into a lot of the standard Oscar buzz films that already had a lot of traction last year.
I think it's interesting how people approach years a little bit differently. Of the films that are on my radar right now, I think I've seen essentially everything I expect will crack my top 5. So I'm sure more films will come on that radar in the future. The only real exception to that is Eric Powell's new film, Journal de Septembre, which unfortunately is not available yet. So I just love his personal essay films. The Second Night was my favorite film of 2016. So that's the one film I think could crack my top 5 that I still haven't seen. But aside from that, I'm really happy. 2019 was quite a solid year, especially compared to the decade as a whole. So I'm really excited to start talking about my top 5 films. I love all of them.
I think it's interesting what Chris has said about getting through films on his radar and being quite confident with his top 5 or top 10 for each year. Because before the podcast, I actually sat down and I went through my top 10 lists ever since I got into films about 19 years ago. For each year, I'm averaging around 3 or 4 films in my top 10 of films that I didn't actually see during awards season or in the months shortly afterwards. And there are 3 years among that for which my number 1 film was actually a film that wasn't on my radar and which I didn't see until at least 12 months after the year had ended.
So I think it's interesting to speak about a year so shortly after it is ended, especially because we can compare it to how we feel about it later. I think there's value in seeing what we loved at the time and what made its way to us, and then what will be rediscovered. Like Chris, there are only a few films that I haven't seen that I would have really wanted to see, like Vitalina Varela, and some others that are on your list. But certainly in 5-10 years' times, I'm sure there will be other films that I'm not even aware now. I guess I'm in the middle between you two.
Oh, absolutely. I think when I say films are on my radar right now, that's what I'm referring to as well. I'm pretty sure there will be a few more surprises and discoveries coming over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm really looking forward to our Forum Film Festival as well, where our programmers are just working so hard, going through so many obscure films from the last 4 years or so and bringing them all to us. And I find new favorites there every year. So I'm sure I will discover a few new 2019 favorites there as well. And with that said, let's get into the top 5 lists, and we can start with Clem.
Okay, so my pick for number 5 film of the year is a film I won't be discussing too much because Tom also has it in his list, and it is the Oscar-nominated film Corpus Christi.
So like Clem, I really enjoyed Corpus Christi, and that's why it made it to number 5 on my top films of 2019. And it's a gritty character study from Poland that offers an engaging insight into the life of a reformed criminal, Daniel, who masquerades as a priest. It explores the notions of faith and deception. Only devoid of morality becomes the most moral person in a gripping storyline that inevitably leaves audiences firmly invested in Daniel's fate. The impressive central performance from Bartosz Belina is what makes the film so captivating, but the direction and screenplay are also exceptional. And it's no surprise that Corpus Christi was nominated for Best International Film at this year's Oscars. It's just a shame that it never stood a chance against a certain film that will be discussed in more detail later on.
Yeah, I also loved Corpus Christi. I think it's just something that does so well with taking such a soft and slow pace and focusing in on our leads, this painful, drug-addled eyes, these strong eyes that stares at you. There's just so much emotion in those eyes and making it an incredibly powerful film.
I don't think I loved Corpus Christi as much as you guys, though I did like it. But one thing I definitely agree on is the central performance by Bartosz Bielenia, I guess it's pronounced. He's excellent, and the film really entirely relies on him. My number 5 is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. As the title indicates, it's a fairy tale taking place in a particularly key period in the history of Hollywood, 1968, with New Hollywood coming in and the counterculture taking over. Tarantino makes it a simultaneously joyous and mournful hangout film centered on 2 real movie star performances from DiCaprio and Pitt. It's about the last remnants of an outdated system watching as the world moves on from them. But it's really also about Brad Pitt cruising around LA while listening to the radio. And there's something immensely satisfying to me about that. Maybe because Tarantino is quite obviously enjoying himself so much with this period, and if there's one thing he's good at, it's sharing that enthusiasm.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And like I said, really is a fairy tale as well. We will actually do a Tarantino podcast sometime in the near future. One thing I'll bring up there too is just the way he creates what can be called sandbox cinema. And it's so interesting that he does that with a real story and with a real backdrop in the Manson family murders. We essentially just have this broad Hollywood world, our 2 lead characters just driving around and hanging out in this massive sandbox with all of these things, especially for those of us who know the story, just around the corner or just to the side of it, which is really interesting.
I also love Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It was very close to making my top 5. I love what Matthieu says about Tarantino having fun with it. It's such a playful film, and you know that Tarantino's really enjoyed making it, and there's some excellent tension in there as well. So I'd recommend it to anyone who hasn't caught it yet.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was a film that I enjoyed the vast majority of. For me, it fell apart towards the end with the ending that Tarantino puts in place. His plot deflection there is something very similar to what he's done before without me putting any spoilers in. It's the best that I can say. And I was like, yep, Tarantino is just copying himself now. I thought it was maybe a bit of a cop-out ending. It was funny with what happened. I was laughing a little bit, but I thought this is just very derivative of what Tarantino has also done. The other thing which underwhelmed me about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was Margot Robbie's character of Sharon Tate and her performance. It's really a nothing character and a nothing performance. She doesn't really have any pivotal scenes in there. The biggest scene is, I think, going and watching a movie in which she's had a role and she sits back and watches and enjoys and puts her feet up and laughs. And I can understand that it's sort of interesting the way that Tarantino is defying our expectations, that we think it's going to be a film about Sharon Tate, that we think it's going to be about the Manson murders, and it's actually not. So all that's kind of interesting. But then my favorite parts of the film were the parts with Leonardo DiCaprio. They were the parts with Brad Pitt. The Margot Robbie side of the story, I would have actually preferred to really maybe not even be there at all, considering the way the plot actually ends up going without me spoiling it too much. I mean, I thought it was a good film. I thought it was a solid film. People were saying, though, that it was Tarantino's best film. And I'm like, no, it wouldn't be even top 5 Tarantino for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And if you used the word derivative previously, that's pretty much what it is. I mean, in some ways, it's a summary film of what he's done before. He's playing homage to so many of his previous films and playing around with it a bit as well. And that works, and it's great to see. But it does feel a bit slight. It doesn't have the power of many of his previous films. It doesn't have the high comedic edge of some of his previous films. But it's still really inventive and it's still really fun. And unlike you, I actually absolutely loved the ending. I thought it was also very, very fitting. But I'm not going to go into why that is either, because spoilers.
Well, I do think this is slightly spoilery, but I do want to respond about the ending. Yes, he's done it before with Inglourious Basterds. That's definitely true. But I think it's really what the film is about. It's what I mentioned when I said it's a fairy tale. It's obviously a violent fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale ending.
So, Saul, what's your 5th favorite film of the year?
So the film that I've picked for 5th is a film that did get a little bit of buzz at the time, but ended up getting 0 Oscar nominations. And it's a film called Just Mercy. It's from Destin Daniel Cretton, who's a director you might not have heard of before, but he directed a great film that was really big a few years ago called Short Term 12. It was the film that had really launched Brie Larson's career, and also has a young Rami Malek in it. A very powerful film that I would highly recommend. Just Mercy isn't quite as powerful as Short Term 12, but it's similar in the way that it's very focused on the characters and very focused on the performances. Without going too much in the plot, it's basically about a black man who's wrongfully convicted of murder and he's being tried in deeply racist Alabama. And a young black lawyer comes in to defend him. And this is a film that wasn't even on my radar. I didn't know anything about it until the SAG nominations came out. And Jamie Foxx got a nomination for Best Supporting Actor. And Jamie Foxx is absolutely excellent in it. It's not just your typical wrongly accused man performance. He goes through the whole gamut of emotions. It goes from disbelief to despair to cynicism. And most of it's actually spent on the cynicism part of it. So a lot of it is with the young lawyer played by Michael B. Jordan, who's also fantastic, going in, telling Fox that he's going to defend him, and Fox is sort of at this stage where he just doesn't care about it because he thinks the whole system is rigged against him. The film does get a little bit sentimental at times, but is so well acted, and beyond Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan, you've also got some excellent work from Rob Morgan and Tim Blake Nelson as a couple of unfairly treated prisoners. And while maybe not necessarily one of the top 5 films of 2019, it's definitely one of the more overlooked films. Something I'll probably mention about Just Mercy is, like Short Term 12, it has Brie Larson in it, but it's actually really a forgettable, underdeveloped role. Nothing compared to the powerhouse performance that she gave in Short Term 12, but still a film that I would highly recommend it. I saw it with a few friends, and they were also very impressed by it.
So it seems no one else has seen Just Mercy, so it truly is an overlooked film. So thank you for bringing it to our attention, Saul. My number 5 is probably one of the most cinematic documentaries that I've ever seen, actually. It is, of course, Honeyland, which was also nominated not just for Best documentary, but Best Foreign Film at the Oscars. We follow Hatice, who is an aging beekeeper in North Macedonia living in complete isolation with her ailing mother. The beauty here is that, there's no interviews, there's no conversations with her. The whole film is driven by her presence and her movements and her conversation with the people around her. For much of the film, it's actually just her alone as well, tending to her bees, doing her work. And it's done with such cinematic clarity that many may not even realize it's documentary. I mean, you have these just beautiful scenes of her just walking to her bees, play with shadows, play with nature. It's absolutely fantastic to look at. And then we actually get a full-on complex plot as new neighbors come out of nowhere, a family struggling with money, out of desperation turn to beekeeping as well, upsetting the entire ecosystem around her. And what is so fascinating here is that the family is consistently portrayed sympathetically, despite their actions harming Hatice in so many ways. It's really worth noting that the crew followed her and her neighbors for about 3 years. And this is also why everyone became so comfortable with the cameras and why they managed to catch so many tender and cinematic moments and just let it unfold. And we can feel just these counterfolds. We can feel the drama. We can feel the unrest between them. And this near civil war, or this Cold War rather, between them, the emotions, desperation, everything there can be felt so strongly. It's just a truly incredible work. And all right, that's all of our number 5 summed up. So, going on to our next position, number 4, and starting once again with Clem.
My pick for number 4 is a film from Canada, which is called Répertoire des villes oubliées, which in English title is Ghost Town Anthology. It takes place in a small village in Quebec, where a young man dies in a car crash. And it shows how the whole village, the small village, is shaken. It shows their grief throughout the film. It also shows the talk that people have about the accident and how some people think it wasn't really an accident. The kind of small talk you would expect in this small village in the situation. It also shows that how much the entire village just focuses on this event throughout days and days and days without being really able to move on. I thought the film had an amazing atmosphere. It takes place in winter, so there is a lot of snow. It has this dreamlike impression. It also takes some kind of a fantastic, creepy turn, let's say, in the second half that really adds something to the film. It also has some quite interesting characters.
Yeah, so I watched this one for this episode, and certainly there is a very strong sense of mood in that film, and it's really the big selling point. And it is maybe not unique. It reminded me a bit of the horror movie Grave, called Raw in English. It kind of starts like that, and it goes into a bit of another mood later. But yes, this mood is very all-encompassing in the film, and it really sells this idea of these small towns kind of emptying themselves, and which is what all the film is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Ghost Town Anthologies as well. I didn't love it, but it's certainly a good film, and it works really well as just this kind of quirky mood piece that plays around with a little bit too many ideas. Like it's plays with some digital shots that are quite poor quality and everything else. It plays with dark comedy. It plays a little bit with horror. And it's this mix of horror, comedy, quirky, oddball indie film that has this very precise mood. It has a decent bit to say about these small towns and taking the ghost town idea to the next level, let's say. It was certainly a really enjoyable viewing. And moving on to Matthieu.
So my number 4 is Knives Out. I'm a big fan of whodunits in both literature and cinema, and this is a particularly playful entry in a genre that really benefits from a light satirical touch and a very game cast. And this definitely has both of those. But I think what really makes the film tick for me is Ana de Armas as the moral and emotional center of the film. And then there's the denouement, which strikes this ideal balance where I didn't quite figure out what was coming, but I felt like I had the tools to do so. So when it came, it felt quite satisfying, as well as keeping the film's clever comedic energy.
I was a really big fan of Knives Out also. What I thought was really great was the way the director plays around with chronology in the film to reveal certain details at specific times. So we're actually seeing it all in chronological order. I really liked the mansion. It was a really great setting there. There were some really fun supporting turns, including character actor from the 1980s, Emmett Walsh, as a security man. He'll still use his old VHS tapes and an old 80s VCR. Some things that I didn't like too much about the film. I didn't like Daniel Craig's accent. That was very distracting for me. And I also thought the vomiting thing was a bit silly and whatever. But overall, I was really into the film. I loved every minute of it. I know some people complain it was a bit too long, but I thought it was great. And I can't wait for the sequel.
I really enjoyed Knives Out as well. Not quite enough for it to make my list of favourites, but I thought it was a really fun whodunit. There was an excellent cast. Like Matthieu, I really thought that Ana de Armas shone in this role. I thought she was excellent in Blade Runner 2049, and it's great to see her get more work. My number 4 film is Sorry We Missed You by Ken Loach. Now, Ken Loach is perhaps one of the greatest British directors working today. He always combines powerful storytelling with thoughtful social commentary in his often quite distressing exposés on the working class. Sorry We Missed You is a shining example of this ethos, and it takes a swipe at the illusion of self-employment with a heartfelt story about a delivery driver struggling to provide for his family. This is kitchen sink realism at its most affecting, with another emotionally draining tale like that of his previous film, I, Daniel Blake. Sorry We Missed You can be painful to endure at times, yet it is utterly compelling and of vital cultural importance. Any film that can move me to tears is one that I will certainly be eager to recommend to those who relish emotionally involving pictures, and particularly one which comes from my native country and is therefore close to my heart on a number of levels.
Oh, I also saw Sorry We Missed You. It was a film that I thought was very emotionally charged. I thought it had excellent performances all around, especially from the daughter and from the lead actor, and just the whole situation that he gets himself in, and that he has to keep doing this delivery job no matter what. It was very powerful. I thought it was equally as powerful as I, Daniel Blake. I was a bit sad when it came up to awards season and it didn't get the same sort of attention at the BAFTAs and other places that I, Daniel Blake did, because I feel they're very much cut from the same cloth and very similar, effective, powerful personal dramas, as Ken Loach has done well throughout his career, but particularly, it seems, of late.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed Sorry Missed You, and I actually think it was better than I, Daniel Blake. It just has this much stronger core because you see this entire family struggling with this reality. And what Ken Loach does so incredibly well is you can just so openly and so clearly see how this is breaking down each character. It's just this way he strips back all of the drama around them, let them, his characters, be a little bit more honest, and just puts them into these harsh and often like really hard conversations, really heavy emotions, but he does it with such clarity that it feels so incredibly strong.
That's an interesting point that you mentioned about Sorry We Missed You, because it affects the entire family. The other thing about Sorry We Missed You is the whole thing is a drama, whereas with I, Daniel Blake, I don't know, different people I've talked to have got different opinions on it, but I thought at times I, Daniel Blake was sort of making fun of him a little bit. Like when he's out using the computer in this public internet cafe and he runs the mouse over the computer screen. When I saw that in cinemas, some people were laughing at it. I don't know if it was intended as a laugh, but some parts of it did feel a little bit lighthearted. Whereas Sorry We Missed You is a hard-hitting drama the entire way through.
I think all of Ken Loach's films have, at least most of them, have these lighter elements in them to a little extent. You can feel some of the love characters have for each other, some of the compassions they have, and these kinds of humor is also just to show how out of place the characters can be. But then I can see what you mean. It's certainly even more exhaustive and more claustrophobic than I, Daniel Blake. Though both films do have the same feeling of, especially its lead characters, just being driven to the bone by whichever system it is. In obviously I, Daniel Blake, it was just government bureaucracy in itself, and here it is this company that's employing him. But you can just feel their agony as they're coming up against this just unyielding system. And this is also something that Ken Loach has done so well, particularly of late, where these systems of power that is consistently pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing on lead characters. Now, this can also be a little bit too clear, a little bit too obvious in just how it's communicated to us, which is why it's not necessarily in my top 5, but it still has so much power.
So the film that I've picked for my number 4 was a film that came out last year. It had a little bit of awards buzz. It got a DGA nomination for Best Directional Debut, but it didn't get any really big awards, didn't get any Oscar nominations. The film is called Queen and Slim. It's about a couple. They're going out on their first date. They're an African-American couple. And during their first date, they get pulled over and they're pretty much forced to shoot a racist policeman in self-defense. And they end up going on the lam and they unwittingly become folk heroes when dash cam footage of the whole shooting incident goes viral. The trailers for the film compared it to Bonnie and Clyde. There's a little bit of dialogue in there. One of the characters compares the protagonist to Bonnie and Clyde. But what's interesting is that this veers away from it. So it's not like these characters have chosen to do it. And a lot of the film involves the characters trying to process how they've become folk heroes, and they're not really comfortable with this status that they've managed to acquire. And they find themselves in this position where they're just forced to flee because the authorities are not going to believe anything that's happened to them. And the connection becomes really real, and you really feel them bonding over the course of the film. But it's a bit different from Bonnie and Clyde, even though they're perceived as a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. Whatever the case, the film is very strongly acted by Daniel Kaluuya, who was in Get Out and got an Oscar nomination for that. He was also in Widows and Sicario. He's delivered a lot of strong performances of late, and this is another great turn for him, as well as Jodie Turner-Smith. And it's a film that was quite funny at times. I was laughing out loud here and there, but it's also just a really powerful look at racial profiling, the difficulties of overcoming racially charged violence, as well as how videos these days go viral and the difficulty of trying to divorce yourself from folk hero status if suddenly you become the celebrity because of something that you did without actually wanting to do it.
So I agree that Queen and Slim moves a bit away at some points from Bonnie and Clyde. I do think it's always in conversation with it. Especially you have even shots like when there's a picture taken of them when they're on the hood of the car that directly, to me, evokes a scene in Bonnie and Clyde. I think there's a lot of the idea of re-actualizing the story of Bonnie and Clyde in a different context with African-American people and, of course, as you mentioned, with social media playing a role, though really a similar role as the press does in Bonnie and Clyde. And I also want to mention that, yes, I agree that Daniel Kaluuya is really, really good in this film. He's a really standout performance for me of the year overall, actually, even if that the film has some limitations, but he's really great in it.
Very pleased to hear that you like the film also, Matthieu, and Daniel Kaluuya's performance. He's just an extremely down-to-earth actor, and especially when you get a film like Get Out, which is a bit out there, it's a little bit funny or whatever, what's happening is really extreme. He always manages to be down-to-earth, and again, Queen and Slim is another really great down-to-earth turn from him. I think you're right about the connection you've made with Queen and Slim versus Bonnie and Clyde, and the role the press played in Bonnie and Clyde. I know we're not meant to admit things like this or not meant to apologize for it, but it's been over 5 years since I've seen Bonnie and Clyde. It is one of my all-time favorites. And perhaps if I'd seen it a bit more recently, or maybe if I rewatch it and rewatch Queen and Slim, I'll be able to pick up on more connections. But yeah, I just thought it was really interesting the way that the film was so happy and so interested in referencing Bonnie and Clyde, but also, like you said, doing something else with the myth and showing how that sort of story can be applied differently in modern times.
My fourth favorite film of the year is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I know is Matthieu's favorite film of the entire year. So I'll let him present that towards the very end. And that puts us all the way up to our third choice, which we'll start to dedicate a little bit more time to. So, starting again in alphabetical order, Clem, what's your third favorite film of the year?
So, for the third favorite film of the year, I'm giving the spot away to Deerskin by Quentin Dupieux. The movie is about a guy, played by Jean Dujardin, who buys himself a coat made in deerskin, obviously, and who will, throughout the film, become a little bit obsessed, let's say, with the coat. He checks in an hotel in a small French village and pretty much spends his time admiring his coat, wearing him, walking around, showing it. But as the film goes on, he will need money because he has other plans in mind. I saw the film as a man wanting to escape, let's say, his life and somehow returning to nature. We don't know really much about him, but it seems to be the regular type of person who just has some kind of an obsession and going back to a small village and buying a new coat was for him something maybe that would break, I don't know, the monotony of his life. Regarding now the filmmaker, Quentin Dupieux, I thought the film was a logic progression, let's say, in his filmography. I've seen almost all of his films. I think I'm just missing his first two films. But I thought it was less absurd film than his previous one and a little bit more structured, let's say, and easier to follow that his previous films were. And in the sense, it's similar to his previous film, the one he made right before, which was Au Poste, which I thought was a little at the time also less absurd and more structured than his other films. So it seems to be a logic progression for him. It still features some absurd scene, of course. We can still see that Dupieux made the film. But I was talking to a friend about it who was also a fan of Dupieux, and he said that he didn't like his last two films, so Au Poste and Deerskin. So it would seem that Dupieux is changing his style a little bit, going maybe through more conventional films, and for some it seems that it didn't work, at least for his fans of films like Reality or Rubber. It works really well for me, but I can definitely understand fan of the first hour be a little bit disappointed with the path he's taking now.
So interestingly, I saw Le Dain and Au Poste. Those are the only two Quentin Dupieux films I've seen. And both times I went, well, this is not that weird, because I had heard that he was a very weird filmmaker, right, who went a really absurd approach. And certainly it does appear that those two films are much less absurd than previous films, since from that reputation. But they're still certainly off-kilter. And Le Dain is certainly that way, Deerskin. And I think Jean Dujardin is really good at playing roles of people who have kind of a thin grasp on reality, and he's excellent here.
I watched Deerskin this week purposefully to catch up for the episode, and I did really enjoy it. It was quite quirky and intriguing, although it did feel a little slight. There were times where it felt like the film could have potentially been better as a short film rather than a feature film. But on the whole, it was a positive experience, but perhaps not as good as Rubber.
Really enjoyed Rubber, and I thought The Dame was a really good film, though, well, it does feel a little bit light. It's just 77 minutes long. I feel like something more could have been built in there. So like you said, it could have been a shorter film or it could have been a slightly longer film with more depth. There was something that was just a little bit thin, especially in the relationship between Dujardin and Adèle Hanel. But one thing that was really interesting is this idea, which comes from Rubber too, that you have both the action and the observation of the action. Because here, of course, to then start filming what he's doing, these bizarre things that starts evolving a little bit into the horror territory. And Hanel is editing it for him. And you just have this, just as in Rubber, you have someone watching it and someone doing it. And it's just really interesting how about 10 years apart, he's still delving into that kind of dynamics.
I really loved Deerskin. I thought it was a great film. I agree that Rubber works a bit better overall, but I thought it was really good. I thought it was great that it was kept down to 77 minutes because I thought it really got to the heart of what it was about. The whole idea of filming and editing, like Chris has said. But it also was just really, really funny. And just the whole idea of him conversing with the deerskin and the deerskin asking him to buy more deerskin. There's some hilarious parts in there, like one where he films these people or whatever saying that they'll never wear a jacket again, and they throw it in the boot of his car, and he's going to go to drive off, whatever. And like, what about our jackets? And he's like, you said you never wear a jacket again. I've caught you on film. You're fucked. And he just drives off. There's just some hilarious parts in there about that. And how he keeps buying more deerskin stuff. He basically, without spoiling it too much, pretty much becomes a deer himself by the end of the film. And I don't want to give away the ending, but the ending is absolutely pitch perfect in that regard. Totally adhering to that metaphor. And I think Adele Hanel, who's an actress who I've loved ever since 2002, when I saw her in a film called The Devils, where she's fantastic, I thought she was really good also. And it's a character who seems so straightforward at first. But as the movie progresses along, she becomes more and more complex than we first realize who she is. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. It would have been a different film as a short film, but I thought at 77 or 80 minutes long, I thought it filled its purpose really well.
I just want to also add in that I completely agree. These parts are absolutely hilarious, especially the meta elements where he films these people playing these roles, which is also how the film starts. And there's this grasp on reality, thinking that him filming them saying they'll never wear a coat again is a binding legal contract. It's just his grasp on reality, the way he speaks to their skin, the way like he becomes there, I should say, it's great to watch.
My number 3 is Parasites, which is higher on someone else's list, so I'll just have to infiltrate their fancy list later.
My number 3 film is Monos, and this is a vibrant and arresting picture from Colombian director Alejandro Landres that tells a gripping tale of a unit of child soldiers who are tasked with guarding a hostage high up on a mountaintop. Providing young and impressionable minds with weapons is a dangerous move, as we see when the power goes to their head and the group suffer from infighting. Although the subject matter is vastly different in these two films, Monos provided me with a similar experience to that of watching American Honey. Both films take a look at disaffected youth sharing together in an unconventional situation that veers from moments of sheer jubilation to earth-shattering devastation, and they both have many breathtaking shots of nature along the way. Apart from actor Moses Arias, who played the memorable quirky character of Biagio in The Kings of Summer, the group of young actors are mostly inexperienced, but they deliver impressively natural performances in what will have been a grueling on-location shoot. The foreboding soundtrack is a dread-infused exercise in tension as the deep rumbling makes way for tribal-like beats when the unit relocate to a dense tropical forest. The inevitable descent into savagery sidesteps most of the usual cliches as the collective fight for supremacy in this provocative picture that pits them against each other and the dangerous environments that they dwell in. It is never made clear where the action takes place or even what era the film is set in, but this hauntingly beautiful film is undoubtedly a stark allegory for Colombia's recent tumultuous history and the harsh reality of guerrilla warfare during the Civil War. It uses the blueprint of The Lord of the Flies to great effect, ushering in a bold and dazzling spin on the classic novel to create an unforgettable, almost transcendent cinematic experience that marks Landers as a director to watch out for in the future.
I also really enjoyed Monos. I think my only issue with it was a little bit in terms of the atmosphere and how it's presented, in that I didn't know if it was going for a realistic vibe or a surreal vibe. It seemed to take place in this kind of in-between land where you have some elements that are slightly more surreal, slightly more fantastical, slightly more sensual, but then you also have some more realistic elements there as well. But this experience in these characters out in the wilderness, experience the logic between them and relationships, and just the cinema as a whole, it was really great.
Monos was actually the last film I saw in theaters before confinement. I really liked the beginning of the film, this very unique atmosphere. I mean, literally atmosphere. They're very high in the mountains. I thought that was very intriguing. Maybe I was a little disappointed by where it went as a Lord of the Flies story, which maybe I thought it would maybe get more into the political situation in South America and how that relates to, the people hiding in the jungle and rebellions there. Anyway, I perhaps did not love where the film went in the end, but certainly I found it visually quite arresting, and I am curious to see where this filmmaker goes from there.
Just interesting, again, on the COVID topic, I was going to mention it before and I've forgotten. I think one of the reasons why Queen and Slim hold such a special place in my heart is it was actually the last film that I saw before the cinemas closed for COVID. And I was there with a couple of other people, and it was almost empty, and we were discussing with the people who were selling the tickets there about what Rage was going to be like during COVID, and we never thought the cinemas would actually close. So yeah, it was kind of special in that sort of way. So I think it's time for me to discuss my third favorite, or as I said before, the film I've picked as my number 3, because I purposely avoided mentioning a few Oscar buzz films that already got plenty of attention. This is a film that actually got one single Oscar nomination, so it wasn't completely ignored, but I would have personally liked to have seen it recognized in more categories. So the film is Richard Jewell, which is the latest film by Clint Eastwood. In a summary, the film is it's based on a true story. And what happens is that short on leads, upon investigating a bombing, the FBI turn their attention to the security guard who found the package in the first place. Paul Walter Hauser delivers really well as the protagonist. He's a security guard. He's a cop worshipper. He blindly assists the FBI agents under the assumption that they're just doing their jobs. And Sam Rockwell is also superb as his passionate lawyer, basically his only friend who comes in to defend him and try and say, well, you shouldn't really be trusting the FBI. Now, the film does have quite a large canvas in it, so some things left a bit murky, but I actually kind of like that. We don't know about the FBI, and Clint Eastwood doesn't make it clear. Did they intentionally build up a false case against him, or did they accidentally happen? Did they sort of put things to place and it sort of seemed to point towards him? Or did they really need to have a target? Did they really need to solve it? And therefore they threw him under the bus. It's all left completely murky. But what's really great about it is that it shows the power of the FBI. It shows how intimidating they are when they try and get him to sign confessions and to declare that he's done things, even though he hasn't done them, by telling him he's just going to be play acting. And what's really interesting about it is the main character. He's not just your average trained person. He's someone who constantly puts himself in the wrong position and constantly manages to dig further and further. And even though Sam Rockwell keeps telling him, don't talk to the reporters, don't talk to the FBI, don't tell them anything, he just can't see that. He sees himself as this cop. He wants to be a cop. He's always wanted to be a cop. And therefore he just has this gigantic trust in the law. And the film just tackles some really interesting things in that regard. And what's also really dynamic about the film is that towards the end, Hauser's character actually disappears into the backdrop. It becomes more about Sam Rockwell. It becomes more about Olivia Wilde as a ruthless reporter. And the Paul Walter Hauser character becomes a supporting character. He becomes a supporting character in his own story, just like it was for him in real life. He was initially this hero, he'd found the package, and then he was vilified. So in the same sort of way, Clint Eastwood makes him less of a protagonist by the end to show how it ended up not being quite his heroic story that he thought it would be at first. Clint Eastwood has, throughout his directing career, directed lots of really solid movies, Many of his films, like Unforgiven, Letters from Iwo Jima, Mystic River, are among my all-time favorites. And I'd say that Richard Jewell is probably the best film that I've seen from him since probably 2008 when he did Gran Torino. I might just clarify that Richard Jewell isn't an enjoyable film. It's a little difficult to watch at times as you're seeing the FBI really putting him into a corner, but it's just a really powerful film, really well acted. I know Kathy Bates got an Oscar nomination for it. Paul Walter Hauser is brilliant also, and Sam Rockwell, it just keeps going from strength to strength lately, ever since Three Billboards, and the most interesting performance in Vice. Also in another film that I'm going to discuss later on. He's just an amazing actor. I love him in Moon. He's just been doing such incredible stuff lately.
Number 3 is Roy Andersson's About Endlessness. And I just have to start by saying that, I just love Anderson's Living trilogy, and that A Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence is actually my favorite film of the last decade. The only thing that really speaks against About Endlessness, except that it's just way too damn short, is that it really could just have been the 4th installment or even the epilogue to the trilogy. They're that similar. Now, over the last 4 films, this included, Anderson has developed this unique way of creating existential horror comedies, like just finding tragedy and comedy in the hyper mundane and coating in this muted emotion and bizarre and sometimes even fantastical scenarios. Once again, we are presented with this series of vignettes and a large gallery of characters and situations, some repeated, but most are not. And I think if you haven't seen a Roy Andersson film before, what's especially beautiful and wonderful is that each and every single one of his scenes, his vignettes, are carried out in one complete shot. And this is also what ties in with the quirky offbeat humor. It's just this extreme focus on details. Everything always covered in one single shot. There's so many dimensions. You can have so many characters, so many events happening in the same scene, in the same shot, as it drags out and drags out and drags out. The main difference from the trilogy is probably the fact that we this time have an omnipresent narrator. And she will present each scene or conclude every scene with this solemn observation, which will start with, I saw a man, or I saw a woman, or I saw a middle manager. And these sentences will almost always just end with a general fact, like, I saw a woman who had a problem with her shoe. I saw a man who had walked into the wrong bar. Or sometimes more poignantly, something as, I saw a young man who had yet to fall in love or find love or something similar. And it's just this tragic, beautiful, comedic, semi-surreal elements here that just goes through every single one, including this repeated character of a pastor or priest who has lost his faith and is yelling and screaming about his lack of faith and trying to find some kind of solution to this, including a scene which is just fantastic on post where you see him drinking in his office, is consuming alcohol and sitting there in misery, and then walking through the door and starting his sermon. And that's, again, just all in one singular shot with so much intensity. I mean, this is truly a film about endlessness. You can feel it. And the narrator picking these exact scenes, and you feeling the narrator picking these exact scenes, it just showcases just these mundane, specific events in human history. And again, sometimes fantastical and sometimes even pivotal moments, like Hitler in his bunker. It catches this one singular emotion. I don't think it cuts as sharply as Pigeon, but if you love Anderson's work, you will love this. And the filmmaking and the existential humor and the muted emotion is just a dark delight as always.
I also thought About Endlessness was excellent. I didn't want it to finish. It felt like I could have sat there for 7 hours watching this film. It was just brilliant. The static shots actually capture so much. There's always so much going on in the background and so much to read into. Even though I am colourblind, I can still really appreciate the vivid colour palettes that Anderson uses in his films. This was no different. I think it was a beautiful film. and it was very close to being considered in my top 5 films of the year.
Up to our second favorite film of the year, starting once again with Clem.
So, the runner-up of 2019 for me is the film by James Gray called Ad Astra. It features Brad Pitt, who plays an astronaut who's searching for his father in space, who's been in a spacecraft around Saturn, I believe, trying to find alien life. When I say that he's searching for his father, I guess he's also searching for himself, asking questions about his life, his work. His father left him and his mother to pursue his dream of finding life in space. And it seems that the character played by Brad Pitt is a bit like him and doesn't really want to be like him anymore. He also has a wife that he doesn't really see that much. He's also in space much of his life. It's something that is very natural for him. So natural that even when something quite dangerous happened to him in the beginning of the film, it doesn't seem to be reacting that much. And I thought it was a very, very beautiful film to look at. It was a film filled with great ideas. I love the idea, for example, of the moon being colonized and having this kind of supermarkets on it and having pirates fighting for natural resources. Seems like humans just can't learn, and no matter where they go, they always end up messing up where they're going. The use of music was absolutely perfect for me. It was not too present, and very atmospheric, very fitting with the images that were presented on the screen. Not, in your face type of music, but very smooth and soothing. It reminded me of two films which features this type of men in space having existential crisis, let's say, which are Interstellar and Gravity. I thought Ad Astra was better than the two of them. It's also a bit slower than the two of them, slower for Hollywood standard, so it's not that slow compared to a lot of other filmmakers, but for Hollywood standard, it's a film that I guess could be considered a bit slow. It really gives time to think, to see the type of emotions Brad Pitt is going through in the film, this feeling of loneliness that he's experiencing throughout the film. Now, I'm not very familiar with the work of James Gray. This is my first film from him. But it seems like he's the type of filmmaker who likes to make film focusing on family themes. So I guess this film was compared a lot to his previous film, The Lost City of Z, which I haven't seen, so I won't be able to talk about it. But it seems like it's a different perspective on the same story, which I thought was quite interesting. So yeah, overall, I think it's an amazing film, very atmospheric in a way, which leaves a lot of time for thinking. And yeah, just a very interesting film to see in Hollywood nowadays.
I am a sucker for space movies, any film set in outer space where people are exploring kind of unknown territory. Ad Astra follows in the footsteps of some great films, and for me, it doesn't quite match their brilliance, but there were some excellent ideas in there nonetheless. I really enjoyed the scenes on the moon, as Clem mentioned, particularly the chase scene, and there was an encounter in a spaceship that they meet on the way that I thought was really original. So lots to love in Ad Astra, but not quite enough for me to consider amongst my own personal favourites.
What was a little bit interesting for me is that out of the three recent Hollywood sci-fi films that have kind of been trying to be either 2001 or Solaris, the other two obviously being Interstellar and Arrival, this was actually my favorite of the three, which was very surprising because I have so much more, because I didn't really like both Nolan, especially Villeneuve, better than Gray. But I think what two things worked really well here. It was Brad Pitt's extremely powerful performance and the stripped back way that Gray tells his story, especially the emotion around him and the fact that this entire space movie is really just about Brad Pitt's character finding himself. I did think that was played out a little bit too lightly, especially with the ending, which was studio forced, and just the whole way the entire last act played out, and some of the action elements are a little bit too obvious, but it was still a really, really strong, quite great, and beautifully shot and made film.
Well, I'm generally a big fan of these big space exploration movies, but I actually did not really care for Ad Astra that much. played to me as a movie that did not know what it was. It's actually two movies in one that really did not fully mesh with each other. You have this very intimate, personal film about Brad Pitt, about his relationship with his father, about essentially toxic masculinity between generations, right, forcing him to be very closed down. And that's very interesting. That could work. It's aesthetically kind of Malikian, right, using this voiceover by Brad Pitt. Sure, that can work. And then you have this space adventure with these big action scenes like on the moon and when he goes into the other ship. And that also works. I think those scenes individually are effective. But to me, they really felt like put together without really making sense with each other. As a result, for me, the film doesn't really work.
I can kind of see what you mean there. So I slightly disagree. The action elements were some of the weakest in the film. Like the logic of them just felt too obvious for a Hollywood film, even though it was handled a bit more somber, which therefore made them work within this story. But what truly works, what truly carries it, is Brad Pitt's central performance and just his character development. I would also like to say this is almost a bit like three films in one. Like I think the three acts, both stylistically and emotionally, just feel completely different from each other, which is also quite well done on James Gray's part. And that the second part on the moon and the colors they use, especially in the audio booth, is just fantastic. That's just so visually beautiful, especially the use of red. I think that's just incredibly memorable cinematography.
I absolutely loved Ad Astra. It is definitely solidly in my top 10 films that I've seen from 2019. Brad's Pitt performance, I think his performance is definitely a career best in there. It's very melancholic and it's also totally devoid of his usual charisma. And it's such an intriguing performance here. He's got such tired and longing eyes throughout. Moody narration. It's a Brad Pitt that we've never seen on film before. And I was so disappointed when all the Oscar buzz went to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I mean, he was good there. Definitely Ad Astra for me is a career best performance for him. Some of the films that have been mentioned of being similar to Ad Astra, I can agree with. I think Interstellar is a very interesting companion piece. I don't think Gravity is. I know Tom disagrees with me about this, but as a big sci-fi buff, as somebody who loves tales of outer space, I actually really like the approach of Ad Astra compared to Gravity. Because Ad Astra is all about James Gray realizing that the best sci-fi films about space will bask in the glorious unknowns, the vast unknowns of deep space, what is actually out there, and that's what Ad Astra is about. Very similar to Solaris, whether it be the George Clooney remake or even the 1972 original by Andrei Tarkovsky, which is one of my favorite films. The Tarkovsky's film is all about that vastness of space, mysteries of space, anything can happen there. And like Solaris, Ad Astra is also about making that connection and the whole what he has to travel through in space and the big distance between himself and his father. This really goes into that metaphor about relationships, which is similar to what you get in, I'd say, even both versions of Solaris. I thought Ad Astra was a very powerful film. I like what Chris said about the colors. There are some really great interior shots in there. I'd probably agree that the action parts of it were probably a little bit on the weak side. I don't know if it quite left me with the same emotional punch that I would have expected, but I really liked it. I thought it was a really well done sci-fi film that was actually about space, actually about the mysteries of space, actually about longing, and it wasn't just a non-stop roller coaster ride like Alfonso Cuarón did with Gravity. That, for me, was one of my biggest disappointments of the last decade. And by comparison, Ad Astra is a film that's really resonated with me more than I could have ever anticipated.
And I think it's worth noting that we will actually have a space exploration podcast at some point. I think it will be so easy for all of us to just get sucked into all of these comparisons right now and just go off for another hour. But to spin it down to the number 2 pick of Matthieu.
Yes, so my number 2 is Motherless Brooklyn. It's a neo-noir through and through, complete with private detectives doggedly pursuing leads they really shouldn't, corruption at the very top, shadows in doorways, and thugs in back streets. And neo-noirs, they're all about mood, that melancholy of people dealing with a terrible, uncaring world, and desperately trying to make some sort of a mark on it or to find connection with others. And what really elevates this film for me within the genre is Daniel Pemberton's score. Because the story is about New York in the 50s, it's steeped in the music of that time and place, which means jazz in various forms. But in this case, it's a very Miles Davis inspired score. And I just love it. It's not just that I like how it sounds either, it serves a real purpose within the story, because the plot is all about the wheels of progress, in this case infrastructure, crushing cultural and social diversity. And the music that is omnipresent in the film, even there's a scene in a bar where you just listen to the music basically for 3 minutes, is a result of that cultural context. So this film's mood is all about longing for something better, and that is also what drives the characters, especially Edward Norton as the protagonist. And it's this very noir theme of, is it even worth trying, or is it all just pointless? And I think it manages to feel very relevant while playing firmly within the confines of this very established genre. I really liked all the performances. Even Bruce Willis is good, which basically hasn't happened since Moonrise Kingdom, I think. And especially Alec Baldwin as this looming villainous figure inspired by the real-life guy, Robert Moses, who was a New York politician. Obviously, Baldwin playing someone involved in New York real estate is going to evoke other things, but I don't think the film makes the mistake of leaning too much on that, or at all, really. His character is much more interesting than taking shots at Trump would be. But again, really, the big thing that makes the film work is this strong sense of mood that makes all these noir machinations flow with each other very well.
My number 1 and number 2 film are both the only 9 out of 10 films I've watched this year, and on any given day they could perhaps swap places, but I'm sticking with what I went for originally, and my number 2 of the year is Midsummer. Now, from the traumatic opening sequences of Midsummer, it's clear that you're entering another vivid and unsettling nightmare from director Ari Aster. Like in Hereditary, Aster explores the grieving process and the breakdown of relationships, anchoring his disturbing films with a display of raw human emotions as he coaxes passionate performances from his cast, whilst putting them through the ringer with his macabre and twisted take on the horror genre. After the ominous introduction, Summer transports us to the seemingly lush and enchanting Swedish countryside, where a group of friends take part in a traditional festival at an isolated commune. It is here where we witness one of the most beautiful, yet also most depraved horror films of recent memory come to life in a beguiling visual feast with sumptuous cinematography that puts you under a hypnotic spell. Those expecting a conventional horror film, like two of my friends were when we saw it in the cinema, are likely to come away disappointed. This is horror masquerading as high art, the focus primarily on establishing an unsettling atmosphere rather than jump scares, and the meticulous attention to detail throughout provides those who return to the fray with more to digest and repeat viewing. Many audience members were visibly frustrated by the grueling runtime. I was delighted when the 3 hours director cut was announced, and although I rarely rewatch films so soon after my first viewing, I couldn't wait to delve right back into Midsummer when it was released on Blu-ray. The obvious and crass comparison to The Wicker Man is misleading. Yes, this is folk horror that treads a similar path, but Aster puts his own stamp on the subgenre, incorporating the best ideas from the films that have clearly influenced him to deliver a fresh and original spin on this disturbing tale of a sinister cult.
What really struck me with Midsummer was something that I rarely paid that much attention to, namely the sound editing and the way the muted sound goes so well along with cinematography to create an atmosphere of doom from the very beginning. Just muted music, heightened clinking of keys and other sound effects. It just sets us into the right mood right away. That you have all of these clues that something will go wrong, that this is a horror movie, long before there ever is a single actual hint within the plot. And like Tom just said, this is the film which slowly builds atmosphere and tension and is quite long for a horror film. The director's cut is almost 3 hours long, and it takes almost half an hour, I believe, until they even get to the location where they will be celebrating Midsummer and meeting the supposed cult. And throughout this entire time, you still feel the atmosphere of unease, and that's just an incredible accomplishment.
I quite enjoyed Midsommar. I'm really intrigued about the director's cut because I saw it in theaters, and I can certainly see how a longer cut would be even more immersive and even more oppressive in a sense, which is really key to what happens with Florence Pugh's character and how oppressive her environment is and how oppressive the new environment is for the other people around her, but maybe not so much for her. I also have a very distinct memory of seeing this film in theaters, and there's one scene, let's say it involves sex, which created a very strong reaction from the public. Everyone basically laughed, which I found interesting because often you don't have that kind of scene very often in horror movies where the laughter, it's a very serious movie, but the laughter is very much intended. I think it's a laughter of being uncomfortable, and I thought that was a very memorable scene.
I think it's worth noting that in Sweden, which the plot is set, most people consider it a comedy or a black comedy. And being from Norway and understanding Swedish, I felt the same way as well. It's just it is a very serious, slow mood piece, but there's this dark comedy throughout the entire thing, which makes it incredibly enjoyable.
I completely agree with that point of view, Chris, because whilst it is a horror film, and there's no doubt that it is horrifying, I was sat there watching it with a big grin on my face for most of it. There's a lot of black comedy in there, dark humour, and it's a very twisted tale, but one that I thoroughly enjoyed. And I also forgot to mention how brilliant Florence Pugh is in her role as the main protagonist. It's kind of strange that she got an Oscar nomination for Little Women, considering how powerful her performance was in Midsommar, because I would have presumed that this would have been the one that would have garnered him more attention.
It's like that so much of the comedy actually comes from two things. You have one, just the muted emotion of these often self-centered characters, and two, this culture clash, which just keeps these musings from this culture clash and people trying to understand each other, even though obviously there is this horror element there. So much of it just comes off as so banal, which works so incredibly well to, yes, exactly like you said, put the grin on my face.
Midsummer. Wow. I don't know if I can express how much of a disappointment the film was for me. I went into it with, I guess, very high expectations for a number of reasons. I really liked Florence Pugh a lot in Lady Macbeth. I thought she was excellent in that. There was also the fact that it was a film about cults, and I really like films about cults, especially horror films, like a film called The Endless, which came out a couple of years ago, so I knew that. The other thing is that the trailer had made it very clear that the film was going to be at least a bit of a homage, if not something which entirely references The Wicker Man. And The Wicker Man is one of my favorite horror films of all time, a film that I've seen 3 or 4 times at least over the years. I went in with all these expectations. What I suppose was most disappointing for me is the film wasn't just a Wicker Man tribute. I thought the film, and I don't really want to spoil anything, but the way that things go towards the end, I thought that Ari Aster was directly inviting comparisons between the Wicker Man and Midsummer. Just the way things go down, it's so similar. And yet, what made The Wicker Man so haunting is how simple the motives were, how simple the solution was, and how the protagonist there tragically overlooks the obvious. I didn't get any of that with Midsummer. I did see the theatrical version. I saw it when it came out in cinemas in August because, like I said, high expectations, couldn't wait to see it. Maybe it plays better in the 3-hour cut. In the shorter version, there was a lot of things happening which fell into the weird for sake of it bracket for me, and unfortunately, with it being a year since I've seen it, I can't quite recall all of it offhand. I just was expecting a lot more for it, for a film about a cult, for a film that had the Wicker Man there as a template. And I thought rather than ending on a bang, it sort of ended on a bit of a hump for me. I did like bits and pieces of it. I did like Florence Pugh's performance. I did like some of the relationship and surrogate family themes in there. Was interesting. The setting was great also. I love those upside down shots. So it was really well done. I don't disagree that it was a well done film, but yeah, I can't convey how underwhelming it was for me to sit down and watch it. Although, that said, I wasn't a big fan of Hereditary either, which was another film which I thought was a lot of weird for the sake of it towards the end. So I guess I wasn't entirely disappointed because I guess I knew that Ari Aster already disappointed me once. I'm sorry, guys.
That's so. I think it's also a little bit worth noting that most of the things you say are weird are actually from Norse mythology and Norse tradition. So it can seem a bit odder if you're not familiar with it, but most of the things that happen are actually tied to things that either were done or believed to be done in the old days of Norse paganism.
I can certainly see why Midsummer doesn't work for everyone. It's a very out there film, quite unconventional, and I can see why it splits audiences. But I think that's what makes it so interesting, because it opens it up to different conversations and interpretations like this. And it's fascinating to hear why a film can work so well for some people, but not so well for others.
It's also just interesting that none of us even mentioned one of the main things the film does so well yet, which is that it is a horror film that takes place almost entirely during the day and builds up so much tension and unease in incredibly light environments.
So for my top two films in this podcast, I decided, unlike with my other three, that I will go with films that not only were nominated but won Oscars, because I did feel really strongly about them. And my number two is a film that I liked a lot, and I was so happy when Taika Waititi ended up winning the Best Adapted Screenplay for it. So the film is, of course, Jojo Rabbit. So just trying to sum it up, taking the very serious topics of the Hitler Youth and hiding of Jews in Nazi Germany, Taika Waititi gets a delicate balance between comedy and drama so fantastically right here. While the over-the-top propaganda, over-enthusiastic Nazis, and the Hitler imaginary friend generate some laughs, the film also explores the mindset of what it's like to be a young person indoctrinated in depth, as well as the other people around him. I thought, in terms of the performances, I thought Sam Rockwell, who I really liked in Richard Jewell, was even better, was very effective as a gung-ho soldier in Jojo Rabbit, who gradually realizes that there's actually more to the Nazi movement than what it seems, and his character evolves so well throughout the film. He starts off so gung-ho, and then without spoiling it too much, he sort of defies our expectations throughout the film. It ends up being a really complex character. I thought everybody concerned with the film was in very strong form, especially Roman Griffin Davis, who managed to get a Golden Globe nomination for it. What I thought was really great about it, and especially with Davis's performance, is that it's all about this young boy who thinks he's a Nazi. Throughout the course of the film, he comes to realize that, well, he's not. So for me, it's a film about personal identity and about how we identify ourselves, and it's about him sort of reassessing how he sees himself. He's grown up indoctrinated as this Jew-hating young German, and throughout a few different things throughout the film, he comes to realize, well, no, I'm not. I'm my own person. He also gets into some really complex relationship stuff with a Jewish girl who's being hidden. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it takes it to some really interesting levels there, and some really interesting manipulation, which you might not be expecting in a film like this. So I thought it was really engaging with its comedic take. It's a bit of a 2020 hindsight look at the madness of the Nazi times and what it might have been like to grow up in the era. I know a lot of people didn't like the film, and some people found it offensive, including my mum. She didn't think it was in very good taste, but I lost relatives during the Holocaust, and it's not an issue that I'd like to be made light of, but I don't think Waititi makes light of it. I think he hits some really sharp satirical targets there. The film does not glorify Hitler in any way. He's a very goofy, imaginative best friend, and without spoiling it too much, the film is basically about the Davis character realizing, Hitler isn't my idol, he isn't my best friend. So I thought the film did a really good job, and as I said early on, just that balance between comedy and drama, I thought it was hit so perfectly. It was a really powerful film, and I left the theater going, wow, I've seen a really great movie.
I think it was really good that it also focused on how Waititi didn't actually play Hitler, but a child's perception of him, just as his bubbly best friend. And even have this one scene which I love, where you see Hitler's face, and on a poster the child looks at him, and it's his imaginary friend. It's a completely different face, completely different features. And it really does explore, like you said, indoctrination, but it does it in such a really fascinating way. It's just like from the perspective of a child, who's just so thoroughly invested in this extreme and horrifying worldview, which just to him seems like reality, sensible, and something is taken so much to heart. And that's obviously, the film doesn't take his side either. It's funny, but also unnerving because of his views. So it's just this really complex line that Waititi is treading so incredibly well.
I thought Jojo Rabbit was okay, but it didn't really blow me away in the same sense that it did for Saul. It felt like Waititi was kind of channeling Wes Anderson, and for me it didn't quite work. I am a huge fan of Waititi's work, particularly What We Do in the Shadows and Boy, but this one just felt like a missed opportunity for me.
It's an interesting comparison that you make, Tom, because I'm actually not a big fan of Wes Anderson. I mean, as an artist, I sort of respect his vision. It's very interesting, I guess, how his films have a lot of symmetry in there, how they're often book-ended in creative ways. But other than Moonrise Kingdom, there's no Wes Anderson film that I would say is a favorite of mine. Most of them come in the excessively acclaimed book for me. I find with a lot of Wes Anderson films, it's like running a race. I feel exhausted after watching it, like something's constantly happening in the Grand Budapest Hotel, something's constantly happening in Isle of Dogs. The characters are giving no space to breathe. They're just these gigantic caricatures who are always running all over the place. Whereas in Jojo Rabbit, you actually really get under the main character's skin. You really start to feel for the boy. You start to see things from his perspective, and just some of the complex stuff that comes up with him and the Jewish girl who gets hidden just takes things in a completely different area. It's extremely character-based. It's extremely personal identity-based, which is the complete polar opposite from the showy approach that I tend to expect when I sit down to watch a Wes Anderson film.
I have to disappoint you slightly in that I kind of agree, at least on a shallow level, that Jojo Rabbit has some similarities to at least Moonrise Kingdom and the comedy around the children and some of the quirky humor, but in terms of the actual style, they're just miles apart.
Well, Jojo Rabbit did not really work for me. I think Taika Waititi is going for something that has a very high ceiling, high degree of difficulty, which is to make essentially a comedy, a satire about Nazism. And I don't think, in the end, I find that the film has really much to say about Nazism. I think a good example of that would be the Sam Rockwell character. He's fine, but there's something about the character, which I guess I won't say, but it highlights something that gets talked about a little less with Nazism than the Holocaust. And what does the film do with that? Not anything, really. I just don't. To me, the film feels a bit pointless. It's very cute, but I did not see much more than that in it. And given the use of this iconography, maybe I expected a little more.
That's a very interesting take, Matthew, because I absolutely loved the Sam Rockwell character, and I thought he was really well developed. Chris has said that I have to avoid spoilers as much as possible when discussing the film. All I can say is that Sam Rockwell character comes out as this gung-ho character who's really pro-Nazism. You think he's really, for the Nazi party and everything. And yet, as the film progresses, things change slightly. And I can't reveal too much of it, but some of the stuff that he does, it's all through looks and stares. There's no dialogue involved. It's Sam Rockwell challenging it through his facial expressions, through how he looks at certain characters, and you start to read more into it. What I like about the film is that it doesn't just show Nazis as these two-dimensional or one-dimensional characters. It actually shows them, not just the Hitler Youth, but Nazis themselves, as having a little bit of depth. And look, as somebody who's lost family during the Holocaust, I might be the last person who want to see Nazis explored in depth, but I really think that with all human beings, they are human beings and there are other layers to it. And I thought Taika Waititi did a great job unpacking that. And I thought the film was all about how Nazism can get written off so easily. But all these people, Nazis, and also the kids in the Hitler Youth, all human beings underneath it who are caught up in this crazy time. And the film's all about is about this crazy time. It's absolutely insane to think that as recently as 80 years ago, all this stuff was going on. You'd think that as a human society, we've come beyond that. And yet, all the stuff that was going on there was absolutely insane. I think the comedy mode was a fantastic mode of getting that across. And like Chris said before, it's all about seeing it from the kid's point of view, from his point of view. That's why Hitler's so goofy and everything. So I don't know. I just absolutely loved it, and I just think it's a real shame the film has received so much backlash recently.
Just to be clear, I don't think there's any inherent problem with making a comedy in that setting. I just don't think the film does enough with it for me. It also gets into a pet peeve of mine, which is inaccurate languages. A lot of films do it, of course, and there are great films that do it, but it always annoys me. Just basically, you are starting with an issue, right? When you have these characters who are German, who are speaking English, it's just never really justified for me, but that's maybe another issue and certainly not one unique to this film.
Okay, I can't defend the languages thing. I mean, you've got a point with that, but I don't know. I'm not that great on accents, but I think the accents were at least mostly on the mark compared to something like Amadeus, one of Chris's favorite films to discuss, where the accents are a bit all over the place. But yeah, look, I've never really been one to worry too much about languages or accents. I don't know. I understand that Jojo Rabbit, you're not alone, Matthieu. A lot of people the film didn't work for, but for me, it was fantastic, and I thought it had loads to say. But then again, I'm really big into personal identity films. It's one of my favorite themes in cinema. I'm also really big in films that have got very authentic child performances. I work with children all the time, and a lot of films don't have very good child performances. So when one can do one so well and also portray a child's sense of the film so well, I really get heavily invested in whatever is shown to me. So yeah, I don't know. The film was really impressive for me.
No, I agree completely. So child performances are really great, and it's incredible they manage to at the same time be so bizarre and stylized and absurdly funny. Again, like some people point out, almost a little bit like a Wes Anderson comedy. But then you also have this much deeper, more serious layer where his entire reality is confronted, and just a childlike way he confronts the propaganda he's taken to heart. And there's one other note on this film too, which is just that there are so many great performances in it, which is not that common for a comedy that tries to be as, say, outlandish as this. But I mean, Scarlett Johansson is fantastic as the mother. We already mentioned Sam Rockwell. He has so much presence there. And the Stephen Merchant cameo is probably one of the funniest scenes of the year as well.
Just on the performances, I'll also give a shout out to Thomasin McKenzie, who plays the Jewish girl. I thought she had a challenging role to play in there, trying to sort of, she captures and reenacts some of the stereotypes that boys who have grown up in Hitler Youth have been told about Jews, and also has a really beating human heart behind that. I think she's a really great up-and-coming actress, and I thought she was great. Sam Rockwell was great. Roman Griffiths-Davies was great. Scarlett Johansson was fantastic, had some great scenes where she's playing the boy's father or sort of acting out as the boy's father. The only performance that actually disappointed me was Taika Waititi himself as Hitler. I was expecting a little bit more of that, but otherwise I agree, very strong ensemble cast.
My second favorite film is Martin Eden, which is the latest film by Pietro Marcello. And to avoid spoilers as much as possible, I really want to talk about the unique and simultaneously immersive and distancing style he has created. The colors are just ever so slightly saturated. The contrast is slightly stronger, and there's this kind of play on light and the quality of the print that makes it seem slightly washed out, slightly less real, a little bit more like a painting, but with a bit of an edge. Like, you don't even blink when he mixes in documentary footage and stock footage from the period, even from the rise of fascism. It feels neither odd nor out of place. I mean, this is a style that Marcello has been expanding ever since The Wolf's Mouth from 2009, which, by the way, I think is one of the newest films on the Sight and Sound Top 250. And he takes it so much further in this work. I mean, it's just the atmosphere he creates, which has both the sense of a deep character study and a careful portrayal of which has a classic story, but at the same time we get this kind of cinema and this kind of color use and this kind of structure that would remind you almost a bit more of an essay film. Like, I don't want to mention the most stylistic ones like Harun Farooqi, but you really get this sense. You can even feel like these kind of references or comparisons to mid-career Godard in terms of just the extreme colors, like full-on red backgrounds at times. And it all ties into this just one great, simple story of a poor working-class man who dreams of becoming a writer and essentially trains himself to become an intellectual. That he reads all of this great literature and he has this goal of improving himself. And there's just so many contradictions here that are really interesting, in that he, in his literature, strives to portray these stark and bleak worlds of the working class, and that he strikes up these contrasting relationships both with the socialist movement and with upper classes, and that he really rejects the former in favor of his view of individualism. He wants a better world for people, but he believes it's only possible if people just engage in their own individual needs, consistently rejecting the collective, including collectively working together to improve each other's conditions. And it just follows his path to becoming this fantastical individual, just becoming individualism itself. What works so well again here with style and this portrayal of this is that it puts us at a slight distance from the character. We can assess him better. We can understand we are studying him and studying his acts and behavior and his beliefs, to the point and to the extent that it actually gets away with, without spoiling anything, it's utterly fantastical and bizarre ending, which just works so well as a metaphor. And I think it's really worth noting also that this is actually an adaptation of a Jack London novel, only with the plot moved to Italy. And I think it's also just worth noting that after he had released this book, London was really saddened by the fact that so many people saw it as this, shall we say, homage to individualism, not understanding that it was a satire, not understanding that this was essentially showcasing just how grotesque and how destructive the pursuit of your own individuality and your own selfish ends will lead you. And due to the way this film is made and presented, I don't think audiences will be similarly confused here.
I saw Martin Eden this week for this podcast, and I definitely agree with Chris about the style. It is a gorgeous film, really, especially the way it uses natural lights in the first half. It's just amazing. And I was not familiar at all with the Jack London novel, and I think the film retains an ambiguity about whether or not individualism or socialism are these great ideologies. I think it kind of ends up maybe rejecting both, whereas London was definitely a socialist. I was surprised actually that it came from a Jack London novel, because it felt very much Italian. Especially it reminded me of Bernardo Bertolucci's film Prima della Rivoluzione, so that's Before the Revolution, which has similarly these characters who get into very intellectual ideas and think about the revolution, think about how to change the world. And in the end, it kind of poisons their lives. And that kind of issue of you need to elevate yourself through education, through literature, but also not let it consume you, is an idea that I feel is pretty present in Italian cinema in general. And so it really fits within this legacy.
Martin Eden didn't make as big an impression on me as it did for Chris and Matthieu. I can certainly appreciate the stylistic qualities of the film. There were certain shots where we were taken back to Martin's youth and got to experience his memories, and they were incredible. The initial romance at the start of the story was certainly engaging, but as it became more and more about politics as the film progressed, I kind of found myself losing interest, and it didn't particularly grab me in that area. But it's certainly one that's worth checking out.
I also just want to mention that Luca Marinelli, who plays Martin Eden, is absolutely fantastic in this work. Like, it is the range of emotion and the complexity of the character is just, he carries it so well, to the point that, you know, when discussing this film with Italians, they will actually focus on him more than the director and the type of style it presents. Though for me, it was definitely the style and the visual poetry, and I just can't wait to see what else Pietro Marcello will be able to do in the future, because I think he's one of the most intriguing and most unique visual directors working right now. And if you haven't seen The Wolf's Mouth, I would also really recommend it. It's just 70 minutes long. It's more of a mixture with documentary, but it works with the exact same style in a perhaps even more poetic way. So I really look forward to see what Marcello will do with this in the future. And with that, we are finally up to our number one favorite films of 2019. And once again, we'll start it alphabetically with Clem.
So, my personal pick for the best film of 2019 is a film I actually saw very recently, just 2-3 days ago, preparing for this podcast. And it is the second film from Robert Eggers, which is called The Lighthouse. Robert Eggers is the director who made The Witch, a New England folk tale, about a few years ago, which is a film that I really loved as well. I was really interested in checking out this film because it features elements that I usually like in films. It's shot in black and white. It features isolation. It has two main protagonists stranded alone and slowly going insane, from what I understood. So I was really interested in checking it out. The film is about these two lighthouse keepers. One is more experienced. He's been doing this for years, and he's the character that's played by William Dafoe. And the other one is a youngster. It is his first mission. And the character played by Robert Pattinson. The hierarchical roles are defined very quickly from the start. William Dafoe character will be the one attending to the lighthouse during the night, while Robert Pattinson character will be the one living during the day, taking care of all the chores, cleaning the houses, bringing coal and fuel to make sure the lights won't go out in the lighthouse. And as the film goes on, we see them both slowly descend into madness, well, or at least one of the two characters. It's a almost psychedelic trip, let's say, filled with alcohol, the loss of time, and the reality caused by isolation, and the fact that no one is coming to see them at any point. The black and white cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. I absolutely loved every second of it. Every single image just looks absolutely amazing. The use of light as well is also very, very good, which makes sense because the film is called The Lighthouse. It really accentuates their state of mind. It seems like the light is almost a character in itself, not only the lighthouse of the title, but also the light in general, because it really accentuates what the characters think and also the relationship that the two will have in the film. It's also obviously filled with religious allegory, which I won't go too much into details because it would be in spoiler territories, but I thought it was very well executed and leave us at the end of the film with quite a few questions that are not really answered, and it leaves us something to think about, which is something I really like in films. So overall, I think it's the best looking film of 2019 from what I've seen so far, and I just can't wait to see what Robert Eggers will come up with next, because so far I've seen only two films from him. It's two films, and both films are favorite. So I can't wait to see what he comes up with next.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Clem, that The Lighthouse is one of the most beautifully shot films this year. Perhaps getting quite high competition from Vitalina Virale, which for some reason isn't on any of our lists. But yeah, I think that's just the way you feel that island and the nature on it. I mean, it reminds me of some of the best silent films like Finis Terre, which just does the same thing with people going mad on an island, and this clashing forces and feeling the nature around them, and there's the descent into madness, without spoiling anything here, but there's this playful descent into madness that's shown here, and there's this clashing, powerful personalities of these two brilliant performances. It's without a doubt one of the greatest films of the year, and it's on my top 10 of the year as well.
I quite liked The Lighthouse as well, especially Willem Dafoe's performance. I think to get back to the issue of language, Robert Eggers is actually a filmmaker who cares a lot about the accurate language in his films. Both in The Witch and in this, he uses language of the time. And Willem Dafoe is really having fun with it. The monologues he gets in that old-timey language are so fun to listen to, and also, very disturbing at times. I think Robert Pattinson is not quite as at ease with it. But overall, I did like the movie a lot. And I think the sound design is also worth mentioning as being very immersive, especially with that very horror-ish sound of The Lighthouse.
The Lighthouse was a film that I approached with some trepidation because I didn't like The Witch, or The Witch, however you want to pronounce it, as much as most people did. I did think that Anya Taylor-Joy was fantastic in it, but a lot of the film felt like a bit of a gimmick to me, being filmed in Old English. Anyway, The Lighthouse was a fantastic film, and I am so happy that I saw it in cinemas. Like Queen and Slim was one of the last films that I saw before the cinemas closed due to COVID restrictions over here. And what was really great about The Lighthouse is how dark most of the shots were. So, of course, it's shot in 4:3 or whatever aspect ratio you want to call it. It's not in the usual wide screen. And yet the way it was projected on screen, sitting in cinema screen in the dark, you'd sort of lose track where the edge of the screen was, because just the very center of the frame would be lit up by candlelight or whatever, and all the rest of the darkness would sort of be swallowing up the characters. I thought it was very moody, very atmospheric. I really loved how it played out as an inseparable mix of dreams, nightmares, fantasies, and memories. Not sure what's real and what's not real. The only thing which is definitely real is the emotions of the characters. I thought Willem Dafoe, and yes, Robert Pattinson, I thought he did live up to Dafoe. There's some really strong performances in there, and like Matthieu mentioned, the sound design was very arresting also. The whole thing did get a little bit repetitive for me towards the end. Lots of fights and drinking sessions. What I really liked was all the parts was all a bit blurry. You don't know whether it's a dream or a memory or a fantasy. I thought it was a very good, very stylish mood piece, and it does make me excited to see more from Eggers, whereas after The Witch or The Vitch or whatever you want to call it left me a little bit indifferent towards his style.
I just want to add on what Saul said there about the slight repetitiveness and just consistent drinking, and also some of the slightly more, I'm not going to say childish, but slightly more juvenile comedic elements, with some body sounds, etc., are the reasons why this gloriously shot film and this gloriously acted film didn't quite make it into my top 5. But despite all of that, it's such a powerful experience. It's these two actors facing off with such intensity, and it's just so incredibly powerful. It's probably one of the most powerful films in this way of just the charisma and power of the actors that I have seen all year, for sure.
Like everyone else, I really enjoyed The Lighthouse. It's an incredibly striking horror film. Came close to being my number 1 horror of the year, but obviously, as you heard earlier from me, Midsommar takes that spot. But The Lighthouse comes very close. I agree that the two central performances are just excellent. Kind of begrudging camaraderie that these two men have. And the whole setting of The Lighthouse, it just takes us to a place where horror films don't usually visit, and it remains fascinating throughout. Films where certain shots or images of it kind of come back to haunt you days later and linger on your memory. And that for me is always the sign of a really good film.
My number one is Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, or Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And there's a bit of a commonality with my number two, even though it might not appear obvious at first glance what Portrait and Motherless Brooklyn have to do with each other, because this is a film that is, for me, also defined partly by its use of music. It's only 2.5 scenes, really, but they are very key scenes, in part because Siama really set them up by sticking with only diegetic music throughout the film, which, considering its place, it takes place on an isolated island in 18th century Brittany, mostly means no music at all. But it's more than just music. The film uses art in general as a way for these characters to understand the world, to interact with each other beyond the usual social boundaries, and most importantly, to immortalize their experiences. The notion of holding on to inherently fleeting things, which is basically all we experience, and the various ways in which one can achieve that, is central to the film. You've got painting, of course, which is the main crux of the plot, but we also get the characters discussing the story of Orpheus, which is all about the opposition between the immediate and the permanent, especially as it relates to the gaze, the action of looking at someone. Of course, that's what cinema is. Looking and retaining, interpreting and internalizing. The power that art has in affecting us in these deeply personal ways is really on full display with the two key scenes that use music. And Siama also uses how these characters live these moments so intensely because experiencing art is not an everyday thing for them as it is for us, which makes those experiences all the more transcendental for them, and as a result, so affecting for us, or at least for me. Adèle Haenel is fantastic in a role that admittedly suits her very well, very closed off and defiant, at least at first, and Noémie Merlan is very good as well. It ends up being a surprisingly warm experience that's not really what you would expect given the setting and the actual plot, and all of that make it my favorite film of the year.
It's also a bit of an interesting comparison with Clem's number one, in that they both take place on an isolated island with two main characters in some ways going toe-to-toe, but in a very, very different way. And I agree completely, the gazes here are absolutely fantastic and the performances are wonderful. It really just manages to capture this. I'm not even sure if I can describe the atmosphere, the mood here, but it's just so beautifully elegant. It's so fantastically well shot. The focus on details, and again, especially their eyes and their looks as these two women form a closer and closer relationship is just incredible to observe.
I think you can find on the internet things where the lighthouse takes the path similar to Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I'm pretty sure that exists somewhere.
Portrait of a Lady on Fire was a fascinating film. I did really enjoy it. I thought the two central performances were excellent, but it kind of left me a bit cold. I didn't find an emotional connection to the characters. Visually, it was stunning. Most of the shots could easily be framed in a gallery wall. There's lots of beautiful imagery that looks exactly like a beautiful painting. And the story was relatively gripping. There was just something that, I don't know, it didn't quite resonate with me. Perhaps it was this expectation because there was a lot of buzz around it. I know you shouldn't let that come into your judgment of a film, but I think I was expecting something perhaps a bit greater than what I saw. Moving on to my favourite film of 2019. I love this because if anyone had told me at the start of the year that my favourite film of 2019 would be an Adam Sandler film, I would have probably laughed in their face. He's an actor that I actively avoid due to his cookie-cut comedic roles that are largely unfunny, but I have gradually been growing an appreciation for his more serious roles. Punch Drunk Love being a shining example of his capabilities up to now. Now, Sandler's performance in Uncut Gems is nothing short of a revelation. He brings charismatic jeweller Howard Ratner to life with an astonishing depth of emotion in a frenetic thrill ride from the Safdie brothers, who capture Ratner's pursuit of the ultimate high-stakes bet with a nerve-shredding intensity. A synthesizer-laden electronic score pulses with unbridled energy, elevating the audience's anxiety to extreme levels as it chimes with the adrenaline rushes that take hold of Ratner when he places a bet or when he talks his way out of any number of compromising situations that seem to escalate in severity as the film progresses. Just like Ratner manipulates those around him for his own gain, the Safdie brothers manipulate the audience with their precise editing, and this encapsulates the hectic and frenzied lifestyle of their protagonist. A man on the brink of a precipice who is willing to risk everything he has for a chance to win big. Any film that can grab my attention so swiftly and hold it so firmly for the entire duration, most of which was literally spent on the edge of my seat, and is without a doubt an incredibly potent experience. There were moments where I gasped out loud in amazement and sat with my jaw agape, hypnotized by the incredible events that were unfolding before my eyes. When it was over, I felt exhausted, exhilarated, and overwhelmed with emotion. Heart rate gradually returned to normal. It dawned upon me that I had fallen hard for an Adam Sandler film, and Uncut Gems might even be his greatest performance to date. Any film that prompts me to reconsider my assessment of an actor in such a profound way is undoubtedly a remarkable achievement, and that is just one of many reasons why Uncut Gems is my favourite film of 2019.
I just want to say that I agree completely. I mean, we know that Adam Sandler can act. We have seen it in Rain Over Me and Punch Drunk Love and even the Marriage Stories. But in Uncut Gems, I also think this was the best performance of the year. And the fact that you feel this character, his look, his greasy mannerisms, the way he's always looking for the next score, and the fact he's just constantly talking, trying to sell these different stories, these different lies. You just get caught up in his lies and his hunts and his imagined reality and his obsessions. And you feel sympathy and sadness and pity and revulsion and all of these things at the same time. It's just this incredible, complex, just almost unspeakable performance. Like, you can almost describe all the different ways Sandler can actually entice our emotions in just one singular scene. It's just incredible to watch.
Uncut Gems, I'm really sorry to say, was such a disappointment. So I can't remember when exactly, but sometime over the last couple of years, I saw a really amazing film called Good Time. A film that was absolutely drenched in neon, where every shot was like a painting that I could frame on my wall. A film with a really excellent pulsating music score and a fantastic performance from Robin Pattinson. I couldn't wait to see what these directors, the Safdie brothers, came up with next. When I heard about Uncut Gems and I heard Adam Sandler's doing a serious role, I thought, great. I loved him in Spanglish. I loved him in Punch Drunk Love. I know he's capable of doing such great things. So I entered Uncut Gems with really high expectations. It took a while for it to come to Netflix Australia. I don't know why. By the time it arrived here, Adam Sandler had already won the National Board of Review Award for Best Actor. It got him quite a lot of buzz. When I sat down and watched it, I would agree that Uncut Gems has a really dynamite music score from a composer called Daniel Lopatin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He also did the music for the first film that the Safdie brothers did. Like Heaven Knows What, Uncut Gems was a film where the music was fantastic. It was far and away the thing that I liked the most about it. So with Uncut Gems, I would say probably the biggest issue for it is that I found Adam Sandler's character to be thoroughly unlikable. I found him to be a very selfish human being. And he does have his vulnerable moments, but I felt that throughout the entire film, he was bringing his misery upon himself. So even without spoiling it, some of the stuff that happens towards the end, I didn't really feel for him any step of the way there, because I thought, this is a horrible guy. He's brought all of this upon himself. I also thought the formula of the film was very predictable. It follows basically in everything that can go wrong does go wrong sort of pattern. And by the end of it, some people were saying they felt stressed out. I just felt tired. I was exhausted by it. Probably my biggest disappointment, though, is that I absolutely love Neon. I love the films of Nicholas Winding Refn. I like even the Keanu Reeves John Wick films because they've got such great neon in there. And the use of neon doesn't really come into it in Uncut Gems. It's filmed in a different sort of style. So I did like Uncut Gems. I thought it was a good film. It does have a solid performance there by Adam Sandler carrying it through. It does have some interesting ideas there. But as an overall film, it left me going, oh, well, it wasn't quite, the way I was expecting to be overwhelmed. I mean, by the end of Good Time, I was absolutely breathless. I couldn't catch my breath with this whole ride the Safdie brothers had taken me on. I was expecting that sort of journey from Uncut Gems also, and for whatever reason, it didn't quite deliver it. What was interesting, though, is that after us seeing Uncut Gems, I was talking to my best friend who had seen it and thought that it was a fantastic film. And he said, Sol, you actually remind me a lot of the Adam Sandler character in Uncut Gems. I'm like, oh, really? And he said, yeah, where it's like his slogan is that this is how you win. And he's like, Sol, you're like this with these movie challenges. You keep watching all these tons of films or whatever and deliberately picking ones that you could do for more than one challenge and ones with shorter length. You could fit them all in. So you sort of have that same mentality. And I'm like, maybe I am sort of like that character. I don't know. I didn't see that at the time. It would be interesting to rewatch that with that in mind, but I just couldn't like the Adam Sandler character at all. Completely different to Robert Pattinson in Good Time, where I really got under his skin and felt from every step of the way. Yeah, I'm sorry, Tom. It was another disappointment. Another film in your top 5 that unfortunately underwhelmed me.
I suppose I had the advantage with Uncut Gems not to have too many expectations one way or another, because I had seen Good Time but didn't love it. And I don't think I've seen an Adam Sandler comedy, so I've got an advantage there as well, I suppose. I did like it quite a bit. And I think it's one of those films that's really all about its final scene, right? It's very much tension rising throughout the film to culminate with this, this game. And I think that scene is really good, and basically it makes the film work. I think Sandler is good, but to me, it's really all about that scene.
So my number one film of 2019 is a film that I saw in July of last year. All that I knew entering the film was that it somehow managed to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. So I actually went into Parasite with the blankest slate of pretty much everybody out there. There are so many people who've seen it, including people that I know who aren't film buffs who've seen it since it's managed to win the Best Picture Oscar. And I'm sorry, I will stop talking about Oscar buzz shortly. But I saw this before the height of its popularity, and I don't know if Parasite would have the same effect on me if I watched it for the first time now, with all the hype being built up about it being the number one narrative film on Letterboxd and so on and so forth. But when I went to see it, it was only on one official list on iCheck Movies, the Cannes Film Festival Palme d'Or. Anyway, Parasite really blew me away, and I think mostly because I had such low expectations for it, I didn't know what to really expect from it. I don't want to spoil too much of it because it's one of those films that I think is best edited into with as little as possible. But if I was going to sum it up, I'd say that it's about how circumstances bring an affluent family and an impoverished family closer together. It's a very dark black comedy, and it varies very effectively from utter hilarity to nail-biting thrills and suspense, even some parts which are quite sad as it compares and contrasts the two families and manages to examine class divides and the necessity of working classes to be parasites as such to the wealthier classes in order to be able to survive. With the utter hilarity, there were some parts of the film where I just couldn't stop laughing. There's one part, I know it sounds crazy if you've never seen the film, but this woman is coughing and throwing up, and the father's squirted some tomato sauce onto a napkin, is holding it up, pretending that it's blood, and just the reaction in his face, the reaction of the person who's reacting to him. The scene ended, and I couldn't stop laughing for another 1 or 2 minutes afterwards. I think it was really embarrassing. I was trying to control myself. The film had moved on, and I couldn't get over how hilarious that scene was put together. What I also liked about it was it's about the strength of the bonds between the family who stick together, and support each other. And that's contrasted to the richer family who cannot control their children and they will only suffocate their own children. So it's actually showing that even though they're impoverished, they're actually closer together and they stick together throughout in thick and thin. The ending of the film, I don't know, that part over there, maybe a little bit weak for me, but the film just kept going in different directions. The unexpected things kept cropping up here and there. It was constant surprises for me. I wouldn't quite say that it made me laugh and cry in equal measures, but I did cry a little bit. I did laugh a lot, and I have enormous respect for films that are able to make me laugh and cry in equal measures. If I think about my top films of 2017 and 2018, which is Three Billboards and Black Klansman, those are both films that I was laughing a lot in, but I was also crying a lot in. The Parasite took me through the whole gamut of emotions, while really making me think about class differences and what it really means to be a parasite and how it's sort of necessary in society today. And I settled somewhat the film in 2 words. I know this has been more than 2 words. My 2 words would be see it, probably with a bit of a caveat. See it reading up as little as possible. Can't imagine people not being impressed. So it's a bit hard with the reputation that it's built up, but seeing it in July last year before all of the buzz came out, absolutely amazing experience. It's really hard to replicate, I think.
Similarly to Soul, I had the advantage with Parasite of seeing it rather early in its life. It had won the Palme d'Or already, but it was acclaimed, but not as acclaimed as it is now, obviously. I think one scene that Soul brings up is really key. I was going to bring it up as well. It's that scene with the napkin and the peaches. It really shows the film's greatest strength, and really the director's, Bong Joon-ho's, greatest strength in general, which is tonal control. It's absolutely hilarious, that shot, but it's also mortifying. And the whole film is like that. It goes from one emotion to the other, and really it has both at the same time. And that is so difficult to manage, so difficult for a film to succeed in all of those different areas. I definitely agree with Saul on that. And that Parasite manages to do it while still being this very engaging thriller and also be a commentary on class, much like Knives Out, but I think Parasite is a more humanistic film, right? It recognizes the humanity in all of these characters, right? The rich people, they're not great, but they're mostly oblivious. That's ignorance is their biggest problem. And our protagonists, we are rooting for them, even though clearly they are parasites. I mean, they're not the only parasites in the film, but they are. I think it's a great film, just all around. It really deserves what it got because it is accessible to everyone. I think, like Saul, Saul said his 2-word review would be see it. I definitely agree with that, and I've been recommending to everyone. It's not my number 1 film of the year, but it's the one I would most recommend to a random person.
I think one thing that's interesting is that it kind of plays around with who is the parasite, because at the same time as the most obvious look is that obviously this poorer family trying to earn money and get a better condition from the richer family, there's also this idea where the poor family actually changes themselves completely for the richer family and get engulfed in their life as well. So there's at all times this kind of duality of who is actually the parasites. I think for me, the weaknesses of it also shine through a little bit here, because even though it does so much well and it's a very powerful and great film, it plays around with the metaphors a little bit too obviously in terms of just what it wants and what it does. It's striking a kind of interesting balance in comparison to Sorry We Missed You in a way, where it kind of wants to beat home its points with everything from, the poor people living submerged in the earth and the richer people living on top of hills, and all of these very obvious visual elements to just drive home that message, which obviously also ties in really well with another very hierarchical film, Snowpiercer, that Bong did just a few years earlier. So it's a topic and a theme he keeps returning to.
I entirely agree about Snowpiercer being a great companion piece. Snowpiercer was also very likely a film that, even though I didn't see it in cinemas, I entered into with very few expectations. All that I really knew about it was what was happening in the first carriage on the train. And without spoiling it, there's more to the film than that. So that took me on a really great ride, the same way that Parasite did. And I have been recommending Snowpiercer to the few people who have said, oh, I saw Parasite and really liked it. But none of them have actually watched it yet. I need to get back onto that.
And that's pretty interesting too, because obviously Snowpiercer is actually an English language film with pretty major stars, and it's actually an action film as well with a lot of fantastic battle scenes. So it's just really odd that people wouldn't be jumping to see it after slightly more artistic, slightly more message-driven drama comedy like Parasite, which even though it's quite powerful, it's certainly not an action film.
To Chris's point, I would say that Parasite is a blunt film, but I don't think being blunt is necessarily bad. I think subtlety is sometimes a little bit overrated, and I think Parasite manages to be blunt and subtle at the same time with the characters themselves. I think the characterization is somewhat subtle in some ways, even though the filmmaking is extremely blunt. I agree with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And tying this over to my favorite film of last year, which is Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life. And I'm not sure how most of you feel about recent Terrence Malick. I know that his reputation has in some ways been dropping as he's been pumping out more and more and more films and gone further and further away from narrative cinema. But I would personally go as far as calling him the greatest director of the past decade, or at least place him in the running. Making 7 films in 9 years, more so than he'd done in his 4-decade career up to that point. And each of them, except A Hidden Life, going further and further into perfecting his style and vision. There's just something incredibly interesting in seeing an artist perfect his style and strip more and more and more away until you end up with something as pure as song to song. I mean, it's certainly not his best, but it's still fantastic. And I think that Malick, after stripping away the narrative for poetry and emotion, this flowing consciousness and narrative where the story really is the emotional core and the emotion that's presented. It was so interesting to see him return to his origins. We had a talk about temporary silent cinema recently, and I can't believe I did not put forward Malick as a candidate for a director who would be able to bring something new to that medium, because I can't think of any other director, with the possible exception of maybe Jean-Luc Godard, that has done more to create this beautiful expression of shooting on digital. A Hidden Life truly is more than a portrait, like any Malick, a visual symphony of emotion. It's just this way he paints with emotion that makes him so incredibly special. But here, for once, and just to say this again, it is all centered on one story, on one human person, a real story, a biography. Yes, you get the wonderfully beautiful shots of what you can call the greatest hits of Malick, from fields and farming and grass, hands on set grass, it's all there. But after freeing up his camera from the plot in his previous films and learning to hold on to emotions even into the abstract, he's able to pour all of that into the tale of a man willing to lose it all for what he believes. I don't think anyone can shoot scenes of simple dialogue in the same way as Malick, where there's such power, such perspective, such flow, such movements, the angles and the focuses, the way he creates emotion from the voices, the objects, the way people's hands move, the way the camera is angled and focused in. It elevates every single second and makes this possibly one of the most emotionally strong films that has ever been made. I mean, just look at the scene, for instance, with Bruno Ganz. The fragility that he and Malick brings to the role of the judge. You can see his fragility, you can see his feelings of uncertainty, of remorse, just so tenderly and deeply. This film is such a contrast to watching, say, Night of Cups or Song to Song, where the relationships are so obscured and time does not even seem to matter. In those cases, it truly becomes, the poetry of emotions, above all else. And while that works, in this film, he's really managed to pour all of that in and center all of that emotional power towards one singular individual protagonist, narrative, and story. And that allows you to just feel this character and just feel his life in a way I don't think you've ever felt a life portrayed on the screen before.
I quite like A Hidden Life as well. I'm not the biggest fan of Malick, but I haven't completely fallen off with him as many people have. Knight of Cups, I think, is fine. It looks great. It's very weird, but I like it. A Hidden Life, as you say, is a much more grounded film, much more narratively driven film, and it retains all of that wonderful style, the amazing shots of nature. I agree, the way he shoots humans is quite unique and quite communicative. I think I do have, two issues really with the films. One is, again, the language issue, but I won't dwell on that. The other one is that it is a hagiography, right? It makes its central character to be a saint, and which is, of course, what Malick being a very spiritual filmmaker, that makes sense. And I guess I have an issue with that. You talked earlier about obviousness, and I think that bothers me because no one is a saint. That just doesn't exist. And I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but especially the end of the film, the final, there's a card at the end. I don't remember what it says, but it really made me think that this film was about that, about a saint. And that does bother me.
I think there's more complexity to it than simply telling the story of someone that Malick sees as a saint, but he's clearly, as everybody knows, a deeply spiritual person, and he brings that spirituality into his film. Personally, I didn't feel that as off-putting in any way. It's just, I think the way he can just direct his feelings and his awe creates this awe that at least I felt as well, and he does that just so incredibly well.
I guess maybe it says something about me that I have is an easier time when the awe is placed upon nature than when it is placed upon a single human being. But maybe, again, that's more about me than about Malick.
And with that said, we have gone through all of our top 5 favorite films of 2019. We would love to go through it with our honorable mentions as well, but I think this will stand for now. Thank you so much for joining, guys, and talking through your favorite films. It's been a blast, and I hope all of you will come on the ICM forum and share your top 5 favorite films, or even go further to your top 10 or 20 as well. Once again, thank you for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.